Anybody hear that? I'm fairly alarmed here.
Come on, we gotta get out of here. We gotta get out of here. Now, right now.
Fear not, brother. It's time.
And welcome back to the Knights of Christendom. I'm your host, Frank. I'm joined here with my co-host, Julien, today. And on the line, we called it all the way in from Austria. We got a very special guest. Once again, returning to the Knights of Christendom is historian Charles Coulombe. Mr. Coulombe, how are you today?
Wonderful. Couldn't be better. It is in the 20s outside. It's snowing. It could not be further from SoCal than I am right now.
Oh, I remember my days in SoCal. Beautiful weather over there. Got to pay for it, but it's beautiful weather without a doubt. So,
lucky you two. I've never had SoCal weather before.
Okay.
Well, it has its. You know, there's a great television program in the 90s called "It's Like You Know," and it was a story of it's a comedy about a New York writer that comes out to L.A., stays with his best friend from college. And he's complaining to the best friend about, Southern Californians are shallow and they're stupid and they're this and they're that. And his friend says, that's all true. But the funny thing about this place is that one day you're out on the beach playing volleyball and suddenly it hits you, wow, it's January.
Yeah. There you go. So true. So true. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're here to talk to Mr. Coulombe about American history, past and present, really. And Mr. Coulombe, this is where I like to start it today. We're coming off a very tumultuous election. And I think, now that we have a Biden presidency that's been there for a couple of weeks at least now, the reality for many Americans has set in. Mr. Coulombe, being on the political right for as long as I was before I ventured into more of the integralist camp, there is a sense of despair, desperation, and fear that I have not sensed in the American right or in generally the American populace, a good portion of the American populace. I've never sensed it before. They know that their country is changing by the minute at this moment in time with the far left sort of regime in power right now. But what is interesting, and I'm not here as an integralist to say, see here, I told you so kind of a thing, because I do believe that Americans are good and decent people. But because we've been brought up in this kind of American way of life to depend on American elections to solve all of our problems, there seems to be sort of this inability to think outside the box of how, as Americans, we solve these problems at this point in history. And I think the big question right now that I have is, Mr. Coulombe, America founded on post-enlightenment, postmodern liberal principles. Is there any way as Americans we can sort of, how should I say this? Can liberalism resolve the problems that I believe liberalism has caused in America?
Well, no. I mean, obviously, if some was bad, more is not better. Basically, there are a lot of misapprehensions about our country, about its history, and about its present, because we've got its history so poorly understood. You see, people look at the founding and they think of those post-enlightenment principles to which you refer, and they think that they're the reason why the United States became such a grand power and such a, well, let's be brutally frank, such a very pleasant place to live for the vast majority of its inhabitants for such a long time. But the truth of the matter is that its success rested on several things, most of which were beyond the ability of people to create by themselves. The first were remnants of the pre-Enlightenment past, which were brought to us by our colonial powers. The British, the French, the Spanish. I mentioned the British first, not because I'm an Anglophile. I'm French Canadian. It's difficult to be an Anglophile, but simply because, whether we like it or not, it's to the British that we owe the lion's share of our national institutional life. They were the ones who brought us governors and coroners and notaries public, and the idea of the post office, stuff like that, the court system. We get all that from the English. We didn't invent it. But we do get other things from the French and the Spanish as well. And taken together, our colonial inheritance were our foundations, not simply two gatherings of men in Philadelphia. We forget that. One of the biggest things that was our joint inheritance and was very, very important in the growth and maintenance of our country was a moral consensus. That is to say, the different sects of Protestantism, the Catholics and the Jews, all for the most part believed that the same things were right and wrong. That was very, very important. A second thing, which was in fact created very consciously in the early years of the country, was a sort of civic religion, a sort of worship of the nation in a sense. It wasn't explicitly a worship, but it was implicit. And it was invented for a very important reason. You've got to bear in mind that in the 13 colonies prior to the Revolution, apart from that moral consensus to which I referred earlier, there was not a lot in the way of a uniting factor. The biggest thing they had was a shared loyalty to the king, who, for most of them, had a religious role as well. And that religious role was as the protector of good Protestants from Catholics. It was one of the things that helped undermine George III's position in the colonies was the Quebec Act, which showed him favoring the Catholics in Quebec. My ancestors, in other words. Well, to replace the image of the king as a unifying factor, this religion of the country was created. And it was part New England Calvinism, part Anglican ritual. The Calvinist thing was very, how do I put it, secularized. But nevertheless, one of the things that Calvinist peoples always have in common is the idea that they're the successors of the children of Israel of the Old Testament. They are the chosen people. They came from foreign oppression, Pharaoh's Egypt, or in the case of the Puritans, England. They made a great exodus coming across the sea. And then they found themselves in the promised land, surrounded by Canaanites. In the case of the Puritans, the Indians, the French, and the Spanish. The descendant of that, which still haunts our imaginations, is what has been called American exceptionalism. The idea, as John Winthrop first put it, and President Reagan many, many, many centuries later quoted, well, 3 anyway, that we're the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind. Now that became part and parcel of our civic religion, along with deifying the Puritans and Pilgrims themselves, the Founding Fathers, the Revolution. And then, of course, comes the Civil War, and you've got like 2 sects. The Sunni were the Lincoln worshippers, and the Shia were the Confederates. But nevertheless, I mean, and that in itself, to be honest with you, the reconciliation between North and South after that bloodiest of all of our wars was actually pretty rapid. And 50 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, you had a reunion there that featured ancient Confederate veterans running into the arms, literally, of their ancient Union foemen, which is something unheard of in the annals of civil unrest anywhere. So, I mean, that reconciliation after the Second Civil War, calling the Revolution the first, that was an amazing American accomplishment, right up there with the polio vaccine, the cocktail, and Hollywood. Yeah. Anyway, so having said all of that, it was those 2 things, that quasi-religious thing for the country and the shared moral consensus, that allowed the country to function, that acted jointly as an animating principle. And Catholics, Protestants, and Jews could all participate. As we had our two great wars, this was heightened. You remember perhaps the four chaplains in World War II. Two Protestant, one Catholic, one Jewish. They all went down with the ship, quite literally. There's a four chaplain shrine in Philadelphia. The Cathedral of the Pines in Rindge, New Hampshire. You've got a lot of places like that in the country. And the apogee of that kind of Americanism was really the 50s. Because having, quote unquote, saved Europe in two world wars, I say quote unquote because sitting here in Central Europe, one might have a somewhat different view.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, but nevertheless, this was how we Americans presented it to ourselves. We saved Europe in two world wars, and then we were the guardians of freedom across the globe from communism. And for us Catholics, in return for not evangelizing, there was the chance that we'd get one of our own to the White House, that we'd be accepted. As long as we didn't rock the boat, didn't try to make people too Catholic, we'd be accepted too.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the very day I was born, John F. Kennedy was elected to the White House. And it's been downhill ever since.
Well,
Yes.
we've got two of our own in the White House, and I would say that both. So I've made the presumption that saying that Biden is not that Catholic. Why is it that every single time we get a Catholic president, they're not really Catholic? And there are people like, oh well, JFK wasn't that bad. And I was like, yeah, well that's not saying much.
Well, it's not, and also bear in mind that JFK, the price for JFK's admission was the speech before the Houston Ministerial Conference, in which he swore that he would never allow his religion to affect his conduct in public life. Apparently, he didn't allow it to affect his conduct in private life either, so there wouldn't be any spillover. I'm not saying that's a bad thing because I don't judge, being a Californian. But no, seriously, that was the price of admission, and we paid it. The problem, though, when you make a deal with the devil, is that sooner or later he collects.
Yes.
And that's the downside. The plus side is whatever he gives you.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think, Mr. Coulombe, as we consider what's happened in America, and like I said earlier, I should say, how this despair has kicked in, and American always looking toward a political solution. You talked about the civic religion that was created early on during the founding of the nation and throughout really the 19th, 18th centuries. I think a lot of that has started to break down, and we've seen the far left of America attack that by tearing down sort of the statues and the history of America in that respect. And I think in a time and age where it looks like there's been the possibility that the electoral process in America has been compromised by certain forces and maybe some sort of electoral irregularities. Has there ever been a time in the history of America where integralists and monarchists could make a better case?
Well, probably at just before the outbreak of our second Civil War, and probably during the Depression. But other than those, I mean, we're certainly at a crisis point, especially because last year, the 4th of July, I think it was, President Trump made a speech and found in front of Mount Rushmore. And I remember everyone getting very excited about it and jumping up and down.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah.
But you see, what they didn't realize, or perhaps they'd forgotten, or I don't know, is that was the kind of speech that when I was a kid would have been considered absolute boilerplate for politicians of both parties. Because what did he do? He came out for goodness. He came out for my apple pie and the American flag. Well, in any country that's quasi-healthy, both sides of the spectrum are all in favor of the country. No, really, it's true. If the country is healthy, both sides are in favor of the country. The real question is, what will most benefit the country? Now, mind you, if the country is founded on false principles or weird principles, or if it's a pagan country, or whatever you like, that's not always a good thing. But nevertheless, it is in a quasi-healthy society, it is the role of the political process simply to further the well-being of the country, not to alter it into something strange and bizarre. Now, the very fact that his speech was taken as a rip-roaring declaration of principle shows you how far down we have come. And for that matter, you know, I was neither a Trump adulator nor a never Trumper. He was what he was what he was. One thing he was not was an ideologically based individual. I believe he was certainly, he loved his country. I'm sure that's true. But the very fact, for instance, and this disturbed me at the beginning of his reign, when he was asked about gay marriage and all that, he said, "Oh, well, it's the law of the land now." And several years running, he honored Pride Month. Yeah. And he didn't do anything with the National Park Service honoring LGBTQMXL5 people in the same sense that it honors European Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans, and Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders. In other words, every ethnic group in America, broadly speaking, gets its day in court on the NPS website. But LGBT is added as yet another ethnic group. And of course, I have to say here and now that I've always been in favor, if we're going to start creating quasi-ethnic group status on the basis of behavior, I believe those of us who are Alco-Americans deserve our place in the sun.
Yeah, exactly. So
the millions drunk stagger.
It's just a difficult time right now in America. I've never experienced this before, Mr. Coulombe, and people are trying to make heads or tails where we're going. And there's a lot of analysis about the electoral process.
I think part of the problem is, and this is what makes it so uniquely concerning, is the fact that the people in power, I don't really think they have much of an agenda except being in power and more of the same.
Yeah.
I mean, they have an ideology, but they're very blind about it. Yeah. I mean, just to give you one example, any sane, well, I can't even say that, but anyone in power with a feeling of self-preservation wants to strengthen internal security and the military, because those are two of your major levers. The fact of the matter is that throughout their history, both law enforcement and the military of the United States have been very apolitical, willing to do whatever their civilian masters told them. That has always been the case, even when they didn't particularly like the orders they were given. This was so much the case that in the America of 1947, when President Truman ordered the racial integration of the armed forces, there was no fight. Some people weren't happy about it, but they did what they were told. And if you think about it, that was a pretty major thing. But the American military and the American law enforcement agencies inevitably do as they're told. So what's happening? We are now completely run by a set of people who believe in defunding the police, and now they're standing down the military in order to purge it ideologically. Well, if there's anything history teaches us, is that when you do that to your armed forces, you get them. That's why when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union initially, apart from the fact that they were greeted as welcoming liberators, The Soviet military performed so badly because the cream of their officer corps had been destroyed a few years previously in one of Stalin's purges. This is what makes it uniquely, well, to the historian, uniquely interesting, and to the citizen, uniquely frightening, is that we're ruled by people who, from the Catholic point of view, are evil, which is one thing. From a more historical point of view, in the sense of putting their ideology over reality, they're insane. And I'm not using that as hyperbole or an insult. I mean, their ideology is more real to them than reality.
Yeah.
And history is rife with examples of leadership like that. It never usually doesn't. Well, let me just make my third point, and then ask whatever you like. But the third quality, which I don't think is sufficiently appreciated, is that they're stupid. And I'm not saying that again to be insulting. I mean stupid in the sense that they really don't know a lot.
Yeah.
They're privileged, they're powerful, but they're not bright. And the dumbing down that we've seen in our country over the past several generations, several decades, it's had its effect on our elites as well. They just don't know a lot. And so the problem with that is that evil you can predict if you can figure out what they think their self-interest is. Insane you can predict if you can figure out how their mania works.
Yeah.
But stupid.
I wanted to ask, do you think the feminization of society has a role to play in all of that you just said?
Oh, sure. I mean, absolutely. And it has to be remembered that the feminization of society has been accompanied by a masculinization of women. So I mean, to put this another way, everything is told to be something it's not. I'm going to make kind of a revolutionary statement here and now. I don't want to shock anyone, but
I'm shocked already.
On the other hand, I don't care very much. Me too. Me too. But I'm going to tell you something very, very strange. There is no such thing as transgender.
Oh my gosh, I'm clutching my.
Yeah, no, it's true. But you see, there's a reason why I say this. It's not just the obvious. It is simply that if you're a man, and again, you could be as effeminate as you like, you could date guys, you could wear dresses, but you will never know what it is to have your mind and body influenced by your menses. Childbirth will never be an issue for you, ever. Not whether you want it, you don't want it, should I do this? And the third, and yes, I know about prisons and shipboard, but rape will never be a constant thing the way it is for a woman.
Yeah.
And contrary-wise, if you're a woman, I don't care if you've got a buzz cut, you've got your cigarette pack here and your T-shirt, you know, the tattoo with daddy and the anchor. You do all that stuff.
Yeah.
But you'll never know what it is not to have the menses, not to think about childbirth, and not to worry about rape.
I mean, I've never gone down. I've walked in dangerous parts of where I live in Pittsburgh at 2 a.m, and I've thought about maybe I'm going to get mugged, but I never thought I'm going to get raped.
It has
never crossed my mind.
Yeah, and because you can't bear children, even if you were, shall we say, assaulted in that way, not that it would be pleasant, not that it would be enjoyable, but it's a different thing.
Yeah.
It's just a different thing. And we men will never know what that's like. And they will never know what it's like not to have it.
Yeah.
And so if you say, well, I'm not comfortable as a man, I'd be more comfortable as a woman, or vice versa, you don't know. You can't possibly know that.
Yeah.
There is no way for you to know that. You may not like what you conceive the role of your gender to be, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. And the problem is, by turning this non-reality into a mandatory reality, we're getting ever crazier. The Scientific American just ran this article. I'll tell you, if I'd had dentures, they'd have gone flying. I laughed so hard. Talking about discrimination against female athletes who have X amount of testosterone. All right, translation into the real world. He's talking about guys who self-identify as girls. So basically the idea is that instead of men's athletics and women's athletics, we're going to have men's athletics and tranny athletics.
Yeah.
Well, the reason why you have that feeling of despair, I think, is there's the more or less conscious, more or less unconscious feeling, which I don't think is without justification, that we are now administered by people who are completely out to sea. Yeah. And there's no recourse. They run the show.
But is that a byproduct of democracy, in your opinion?
Also, would you also say that, but answering that part of the question too, to tack on, would you also say that democracy is a feminine form of government and monarchy is a masculine form of government?
Well, to answer the second first, I've never even thought of it in those terms, but that's something to think about. I'll have to give that one some thought, actually. That's your first question. The second question bears thinking about, though. It actually does, very much so. I think that what we have is a perfect storm. You know, no historical event, and believe me, this is an historical event, no historical event occurs because of one thing. It's always a combination of things, some of them causally connected, some not. Which, if at least one of them didn't happen, things would be very different. So take the French Revolution. What was the immediate precipitant of the French Revolution? It was the explosion of a volcano in Iceland. The year without a summer. Crops failed. Yes. Normally, the French government would have either opened the royal granaries or bought extra grain from unaffected places to feed the starving. But because they had gone basically bankrupt in funding the American Revolution, they didn't have any money. If either of those things hadn't happened, if France had stayed out of the American Revolution so that the king had the money to deal with the famine, or if the earthquake hadn't, or the volcano hadn't erupted in Iceland and there had been no famine, it would have been very, very different. But both of those happened, and they both happened at the same time. So things worked out the way they did. As to where we are now, I would say that we had a number of factors that contributed that were long in building. Some of them having to do with implicit problems in the very fabric of the country, which long held in check by the two factors I mentioned to begin with, the moral consensus and the faux civic religion. With those gone, the more corrosive elements that were there at the founding had free rein. There was nothing to check them. And then there were additional things that had happened. The revolution, quote unquote, in gender roles.
Yeah.
The psychologization, the relativization of truth, which these were all contributing things. Where you get a lot of your wokery is the rise of post-marxist critical theory in academia, which, precisely because the sort of people that call themselves conservative in America, they never had much interest in academia or the arts or culture.
Sure.
And so these things were left by default to the left to the left.
You know, so I don't think the right, or as I like to call them, the pseudo right in this country, seems to understand that music, art, fashion, it's all political. And if you leave that to a godless element, then you get what you get in modern culture today, and that's what we sell as a product to the rest of the world from America.
Well, that's very true, and I've thought long and hard about why that should be, because in Europe and elsewhere, although Lord knows they've had a huge problem with it, the arts and culture and all that are things that have consistently had the attention of the right. Why not in America? I think one of the reasons, apart from the obvious fact that what we really have is a national liberalism, which has right and left wings, but beyond that, I think part of it is our Puritan inheritance, which, if you think of the Puritan work ethic, anything that did not make money, that was not obviously monetized, was really not that important, really not worth paying all that much attention to. And so as a result, the arts and the rest of it have always gotten second or third shrift in America.
So basically, you're saying the Puritans were ahead of their time in modern society, where everybody is just a cog in the machine. The Puritans already had that viewpoint that everybody's just a cog in the machine and their whole entire existence is just to work.
Well, let's that wouldn't be all of it. That'd be an oversimplification. But let's say that there's an old saying about Vatican II, which is certainly true of the Puritans. What was good in them wasn't new, and what was new in them wasn't good. Like the country as a whole, there were things in the Puritan ethos that they had retained from the before time. And that kept in check some of their other element. But left to itself, without any religious thing, secularized the way their vision of being the chosen people was secularized into American exceptionalism. So too, their work ethic, which in origin was basically a way of assuring themselves and their neighbors that they were among the chosen of God. It did have a religious origin. When that was lost, it became exactly what you've described. But it required the secularization of Puritanism to go that route.
Okay. Well, Mr. Coulombe, going back, looking at American history, I know recently on Facebook you put up a post with your great admiration of King George III. And as we look at American history, particularly the Revolutionary period, I've tried to analyze from a Catholic just war perspective as to, the justifications of the American Revolution. I've heard we threw tea in the harbor. I know we've talked about a stamp tax act, or they were coming for our guns. But when you look at George III, your admiration for him, and looking at it as a Catholic, what are we to make of the American Revolutionary War from a philosophical perspective?
Well, I mean, the American Revolution was like most revolutions in the sense that it was a successful attempt, in this case, of the segment of the already existing oligarchy to achieve complete power. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's a little complex. For one thing, it's important to bear in mind that what we call the American Revolution was really our first Civil War. And it was in conjunction with what you might almost call the last Jacobite struggle in England. I say almost because, of course, George III was not a member of the House of Stuart. But to some degree, he wanted to be a Stuart king. And by that, what do I mean? I mean that he didn't even want to overthrow the settlement of 1688, but he did want to have the powers, etc., that his predecessor, Queen Anne, had had. This takes a little bit of explanation, but suffice to say that when George III's great-grandfather, George I, became King of England, to ensure a Protestant king, he spoke no English. Now, his predecessor, Queen Anne, who was the last member of the House of Stuart to sit on the throne, she had had a very strong voice in government, She was, as you might say, an executive figure, much like our president. But when she died, George I comes in. He speaks no English, and he's not interested in England. He's the Elector of Hanover, and that's his big interest. So what happens is that an official emerges called the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, in essence, runs the country. And the king becomes de facto a figurehead. Because he speaks no English, the king doesn't go to cabinet meetings. Queen Anne presided over them. So it was the same under George II. George III was the first of his family for whom English was his first language. He was devoted both to his 3 kingdoms in Europe and to his 13 colonies. Now, this is a side of George III that people don't realize, but there are a ton of organizations, universities, libraries, etc., to say nothing of churches, up and down the Atlantic seaboard that have charters from George III. He was very, very interested in the growth of the colonies. Even the New York Chamber of Commerce was founded under his watch, as well as the first hospital in New York City, which is still with us, by the way. Well, at any rate, when he came to the throne, in his estimation, both Britain itself and the 13 colonies were each mishandled by a separate oligarchy. One big one in England and 13 little ones in the colonies. And they varied in the colonies. They varied from colony to colony as to their nature. In New England, the oligarchy were mostly merchants, and they were, what's the word I want? Congregationalist. In the South, they tended to be planters, and they were Anglican. But from time to time, the king would have to intervene at the request of different minorities for their liberties against these oligarchies. Very interesting example, Ashfield, Massachusetts, 1770. Again, a bit of a complicated story, but the provincial government of Massachusetts, dominated by men like John Hancock, wanted to force the primarily Baptist town of Ashfield to appoint a congregational minister. Well, the problem was they were all Baptists, so they appealed to the king, and the king found in their favor. There are literally tales like that up and down the 13 colonies in the before period. But until 1770, the king did not have a direct voice in the governance of Britain. The oligarchy did. He and they, however, were faced with the same problem as far as the colonies went, and it was this. They had fought a financially crushing war, the French Indian War, we call it, the 7 Years' War was called in Europe. And they'd put out a lot of money on colonial defense. Lots and lots and lots. Every year, they had to send over a new army, and my ancestors and our Indian allies would happily defeat it until we lost. But that cost the British a lot of money. And then there was the continuing problem of having to pay for the Royal Navy and the forts on the Indian frontier. Where's that money going to come from? Well, it came from the British taxpayer. But ministry after ministry in England wanted to come up with a solution whereby the colonies would commit a symbolic amount to their own defense and to the debts that they had accrued. Otherwise, it was simply getting a free ride on the back of the British taxpayer, which for some reason the British taxpayer didn't appreciate. Don't know why. People are funny that way.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Now, bear in mind, too, that at this time, each of the colonial assemblies, all 13 of them, which were dominated by these oligarchies, and to give you the nature of what those oligarchies were, the 4 wealthiest men in the colonies in 1775 were George Washington, John Hancock, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and Philip Schuyler. So the quest then became, how do we get the colonies to appear to pay a symbolic amount? As against that, the oligarchs wanted to run their own show. And the oligarchs in England wanted to keep the king from regaining the position of his predecessor. That is the drama against which you have to see the American Revolution. All right. So what happens? In 1770, the king is able to get enough of the king's friends in Parliament to put in a prime minister he approved of, Lord North. And that was the beginning of the 10 years of the Revolution. I know it only began militarily in 1775, but the agitation began beforehand. If he succeeded, then the power of the oligarchies would be broken. If he failed, it would be complete. So it's in that light that you have to look at what happened. It's interesting that the Declaration of Independence itself was almost a direct steal from the writings of John Locke, who, as we know, was made his career defending the revolution against James II. And as Catholics, that's not something we could really get on board with. Revolution fit the Catholic churches. Seat route justice. Well, let's see. That's what it was. Number one, the faith has to be in. One of the biggest problems they had with the king was the Quebec Act, which established the Catholic faith in Quebec and gave my ancestors freedom, religion, and laws. So, no, you can't really say the faith was under attack by the king. It was under attack by the Congress, but not by the king. Secondly, is it so terrible that doing nothing would be worse than the terrible things that will come out of a revolt? In this case, certainly not. And if you look carefully, even at the complaints of the Declaration of Independence, none of them were that big a deal. Not a one. And the funniest bit in the Declaration is where the king is attacked for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province. That neighboring province was Quebec. And those laws were the penal laws. You know, the ones that outlawed Catholicism, the death penalty for the priesthood, etc. So, number two, I don't think so. And that brings us to number three. Is there a reasonable chance of success? Actually, at the beginning, the answer would have had to have been no. And it's interesting that in the first year of the war, in the campaigns around New York, 3 times the British Army under General Howe had Washington and his army in their grasp and could have destroyed them. 3 times Howe let them go. And when he left and went back to England and took up his seat in the opposition in Parliament, he was asked, "Why did you do that?" in a commission of inquiry. And his response was wonderful. He said, "The answer to that question is political, and I choose not to give it." All right. But the crowning result of his throwing the revolution, which is the only way I could put it, was Burgoyne's defeat. And Burgoyne's defeat is what decided the French on entering the war. Had France and Spain not entered the war on the side of the rebels, then it's very unlikely they would have won in the end. Which, however, brings us to the second unfortunate result. Because France and Spain came into the war against him on behalf of his rebelling subjects, George III turned against Catholic emancipation, which he had favored up until then. Interestingly enough, too, it's important to bear in mind that in the colonies, it was a civil war. We totally forget about the American loyalists, but there were a lot of them, including, incidentally, the families of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton and her husband. Loyalists all. And as it stood, they were fairly moderate in the sense that they stayed after the revolution. But 100,000 Americans had to leave at the end of the Revolutionary War, which was a big chunk out of the population as it was at that time.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, as to one other point I should make is that the revolution split, like any civil war will, it split various communities and so on along pre-existing lines. with religious and cultural minorities, the more assimilated they were, the more they tended to be rebel. The less assimilated they were, the more they tended to be loyalist. In the case of the Catholic community, the wealthier Catholics sided with the rebels, the poorer tended to be loyalist.
That's interesting.
Yep.
Yeah. Julien, check your mic. Julien, check your mic, Julien. Think he's got a question here for you.
All right. I'll give an answer if I'm capable. If I'm not, you get nothing.
Hold on a second.
There you go, Julien. We can hear you now.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Somehow I hit the mute button. I don't know how.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of, I think they go together. But would you say, in the light of history, would you say the crimes against King George and the rebels, the traitors, reason for wanting to secede from the British Empire, do you think it would stand up in a court of law today favorably? And do you think it was appropriate for Catholic nations, both at this time Catholic monarchies, to aid and abet Protestant heretic rebels against their Protestant king? Even though they're Protestant heretics, the thing is, though, you're aiding and abetting subjects that are rebelling against their God-anointed king. You wouldn't want your subjects rebelling against you, so why are you aiding and abetting someone else's subjects to rebel against them, especially to set up a system that is antithetical to the system that you yourself embody?
Well, those are very good questions. To take the first one first, no, I really don't think it would hold up. I mean, John Adams himself, who was hardly what you would call a firebrand loyalist, made the claim that a third of the colonists were in favor of independence, a third were loyal, and a third were neutral. Well, even taking that math, which was hardly to be considered stacked in favor of the king, that's a good 2/3 against independence. So you can't say it was a question of majority rule, even by John Adams' standards. As regards the actions of the kings of France and Spain, there are two things to be borne in mind. One, having suffered defeat at the hands of the English in a long string of wars, the War of the Grand Alliance, which we call King William's War, the War of Austrian Succession, Spanish Succession, which we call Queen Anne's War, the War of Austrian Succession, which we call King George's War, the 7 Years' War, which we call the French Indian War. The chance to get back was too good to refuse, sadly. And I say sadly because in the end, both France and Spain paid a terrible price for their assisting the revolution. As I say, in the case of France, because of the bankruptcy and then the following what do you call it? My mind's gone blank. The following revolution, the volcano that precipitated the financial crisis, which brought about the revolution. Terrible, terrible, terrible thing. In the case of Spain, the example of the American colonies filtrated southward into Latin America. And when, in 1800, the King of Spain was deposed by Napoleon, that was the beginning of the horrible wars of independence in Latin America. And again, all of it inspired by our example.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
On the one hand, I don't think it was a good thing for them to do, morally speaking. On the other hand, they paid a horrible price for it, and in a sense have never stopped paying, even down to the present.
Even down, yeah, of course. And Mexico. You say it, but you're quoting somebody else, and it goes, "Poor little Mexico, so close to the United States, but yet so far from God."
Yeah, this old saying, and of course you could say the same thing about Cuba. And in the end, the height of ingratitude was our war with Spain in 1898. That was the payback they got.
Mm-hmm.
So
who needs friends when you who needs enemies when you have friends like America?
Well, indeed, we're here for you, all right. We're here for you and everything you got. No, I also think too, we tend to forget because people often say, "Oh well, if there hadn't been a revolution, we'd be ruled by Tony Blair, name whoever you like." Well, that's not precisely true because Britain was damaged by the revolution. And as Eric Nelson puts it in his very fine book, which I recommend highly, called The Royalist Revolution, he says, and I quote, he says, when the revolution and the Constitutional Convention, all that were over, and the American government was established, on one side of the water, you had a monarchy without a king, and on the other, a king without a monarchy. Now, and then he says whether or not there was an improvement thereby is another issue. But I think that we have deified the American Revolution. We've made it a sort of salvation history thing. But no, of course, that doesn't help us in the here and now.
Right.
Because the truth of it is, that was 250 years ago. And we have the Britain, we have the Spain, we have the world that to a great degree we created, especially after World War One.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
So speaking of World War One, speaking of the Great War, Woodrow Wilson.
Huh.
That great man.
That's one way to call him.
Oh, you don't want to know the things I think about that man. I do hope you know what, it's unchristian. Do you think his sins, his crime to humanity, and especially Catholics?
I'm sorry. Could you say again?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. You just break it up a little bit, Julien.
Okay.
Just get your question out.
Yeah, the sins against the world, and especially Catholic countries, and especially against Blessed Karl. How should Catholics look on Woodrow Wilson and look on the Great War, which essentially was not a war of ideology, but a war between monarchies, which I tend to think that people think of the Great War and the Second World War as a war of ideologies, which, if anything, the Great War ended the traditional order of society and ushered in every war since then, which is a war of just different liberal ideologies.
No, it's true. I mean, the fact is that we were responsible through our president for the elimination of the last really Catholic world power, such as it was, and this was a terrible thing. I recently wrote, thinking of Kaiser Karl, that he was really betrayed by his own political leadership, the leaders of his different ethnic groups, in other words, his allies, the Germans, and of course his enemies, and specifically Wilson, because he, at the end of the day, had it in his power to keep him or to get rid of him. That was how it worked out. But you take the bunch of them together, and it's a pity that they didn't have the understanding that the English soldier at the burning of Joan of Arc did. You know, he said, "God help us, we have burned a saint." Would that some politico on one of the three sides, domestic, allied, or enemy, would have said, "God help us, we have betrayed a saint." But, you know, everyone was going to do what they were going to do, and they were all intent on their own little moronic shtick. And that, as you say, set off the dynamic. It gave us World War II. And again, just as you can't accuse John Adams of favoritism toward the Loyalists, you can't accuse Winston Churchill of favoritism toward the Habsburgs. But he was very forthright in saying that getting rid of the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, the Wittelsbachs, and so on, opened the way for Hitler and ultimately for Stalin to come into Central Europe. That's all on us.
Yeah.
And I can't help but think, and this hit me very hard this past summer. You know, I was over here, and at the very time that they were pulling down statues and burning cities in the States, they rebuilt the Marian column in the center of Prague, which had been torn down in 1918 to show victory over the Catholic altar and the Habsburg throne. They rebuilt that thing while we were tearing stuff down. And it hit me then that what we're going through now might well be something of a punishment for what we did then, and which we have, in a sense, profited from ever since. You see, you can't repent of a sin until you accept the fact that it's a sin. You can't even judge it properly. You can't evaluate it properly. So, I mean, we have to accept the fact, just as someday American historiography as a whole are going to have to accept the fact that turning Eastern Europe over to Stalin at Yalta was a terrible crime. So, one day, we're going to have to accept the fact that what Woodrow Wilson did in Central Europe was a crime. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to pay every Central European $500 a month. That's not my point at all. My point is that we have to acknowledge things which, because of the American exceptionalism of which I've spoken, we have heretofore been unable as a nation to do. I mean, you'll find individuals. And the other thing I should point out is that there has been a big revolution in historiography about the Habsburgs in recent years, just in the past decade, and primarily in the English language. So that might mean something.
Yeah.
There's been a coming together in Central Europe, slow and by spurts, but there's been something of a coming together here. And I think that the growth in his cultus, Kaiser Karl's cultus, now that has been beatified, and the growth of his cultus in the United States, there are now 16 shrines to Kaiser Karl in America. 16.
Wow. Wow.
And the numbers continue to grow. And I think he does have a message that's very specific for us as Americans today. You know, we can't go back to 1918. We can't go back to 1860. We can't go back to 1775. We have to deal with what we have now. But having said that, both Kaiser Karl's intercession and his example have a lot to tell Americans now. He was a man who prayed for the peoples that basically did him in, his own subjects. He died loving them. I don't know how he did it. I couldn't have.
Yeah.
But he said on his deathbed, "I am suffering that my peoples might come back together."
Yeah.
Now, he was a man who lived forgiveness of his enemies. So we would it would behoove us all to pray very hard to Emperor Karl for our country at this particular juncture.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Mr. Coulombe. And I think we've been at this for an hour, and as we start to wrap it up here, I got one final question for you, Mr. Coulombe. And I think along that line, we think of the turmoil and the confusion and the despair that's hit America today with its, again, the onset of this vastly liberal governance. But, for my part, again, I love my country despite my questions about democracy and post-enlightenment civilization. My youth was the youth of the era of Ronald Reagan, and it's an era of American history that I will always look up on very fondly.
Sure.
A time where prosperity was really rampantly growing, even amongst the lower middle class and the middle classes, and I have nothing but good memories about the opportunities and that we all had. And I remember Ronald Reagan, in many respects, almost as a fatherly figure that gave us a sense of security that I think that Americans have lost in many respects. And, it's hard for me, again, as an integralist, to juggle these things of the revolutionary mindset that I disagree with, that's in the spirit of Americanism. But as an American itself, I choose to find those things that are good about America. And that era of the Ronald Reagan years as an era of my youth, it's an era that I will always remember very fondly. And as things really go off the cliff here, at least what it looks like for now, I choose to remember what's good about America rather than just beat it up constantly, Mr. Coulombe.
Well, I think you should. I mean, you've got to bear a few things in mind. Firstly, as I've said repeatedly, this isn't 1775.
Yeah.
We have what we have. Now, what has happened in the meantime? And I also said that our success, and we certainly have had it, was not based upon the gatherings in Philadelphia. It was based on what was here. It was a combination of things. It was a combination of geography and the incredible fertility of land and presence of all sorts of minerals and so on. Everybody came here that couldn't make it anywhere else, but thought they had a better idea. And so we had a very driven population, and they did all sorts of things. And, I like to say that if you want to hate the United States, read the history of our foreign policy. If you want to love the United States, take a road trip. It really and truly, I mean, you think of the missions in California, you think of the Rocky Mountains, the ethnic islands of the Rust Belt. I mean, honestly, it's impossible, to my way of thinking, to not love this country.
Yeah.
When you go into a bar in some ethnic neighborhood in the Northeast, and you just sit there and listen to them. And I don't care if they're Italians or Poles, or if you're really lucky, French Canadians, Irish, whatever they may be, and you just hear them chat, just hear them talk. The American South, our Chinatowns and our ghettos. I mean, it's an amazing country. Its history is crazy. Its ethos is nuts. But you know what? It produced vaudeville. It produced the cocktail. It produced the polio vaccine. I think a large part of our problem, and I do try to deal with this in my book, Star-Spangled Crown. I'm sorry, was that a plug? But the truth of the matter is, we lack two important things, but they're things that we can work on. The biggest villains in America's history, to my way of thinking, were not America as a whole. They were America's Catholics, because we made the deal with the devil. We would not evangelize in return for acceptance. Had we evangelized, had we converted this country, she could have been the greatest country in the world. And maybe one day she will be. Maybe we'll straighten up and fly right. Could happen. We don't know what the future holds. The second is a patriotism that's not built on this ideology, which now only half the population hold anyway, if that. Rather, a patriotism built on the country that we have, the country that our fathers came to, the country where we were born. That's all we need to love it. We don't need it to be the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of man. We don't need that. We need to look at Pittsburgh and San Francisco and Houston and Detroit and Iowa and Maine and South Carolina as ours, as our heritage. It's got bad parts, it's got good parts, like any family, but it's ours. That is what we need, a patriotism based upon reality and not upon this, whatever it was. That's why I say, if you want to love your country, take a road trip and just see what you see. I have to say too, in the years that I've been over here, my love for Europe has only grown, but so has my love for the United States. Because if there's anything not that I didn't know it before, but I've certainly come to realize it, we are a part of Europe overseas. Americans are Europeans.
Yep.
We're a different kind, but we are. And Black Americans are as much Europeans as the rest of us. And in fact, they're more American than most Americans because they've got, other than the Indians, because they've got no real cultural connection to anywhere but the States.
All right.
No, I mean, I'll leave you with this idea, and I think it's an important one. Erich von Kuehnert-Leddihn, and I certainly don't mind quoting an Austrian when I'm sitting in Austria, he defined a great difference between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism, he said, patriotism, he said, was love of your country and of all the peoples therein because they're in your country. Nationalism is the desire that everyone should be just like you. So, he said, a Bohemian patriot would love both the Czechs and the Sudeten Germans simply because they were the constituent peoples of Bohemia.
Okay.
But a Czech patriot, a Czech nationalist, or for that matter, a Sudeten German nationalist, would want to get rid of the Czechs and the Sudeten Germans.
All right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Historian Charles Coulombe. You can find his own podcast here. I believe it comes out every Monday morning.
Every Monday.
He's the author of the book Blessed Charles of Austria, Holy Emperor and His Legacy. And you know what? He is a knowledge, really a mind of wisdom, not just history and facts, but just a gentleman. And he shares his life experiences, a life well lived, a good man. Mr. Charles Coulombe, I want to thank you again for taking the time for joining us today at the Knights of Christendom.
Thanks very much for having me. God bless you all.
Thank you so much. I want to thank my partner, Julien, today for being my wingman today on today's show. This is Frank signing off for the Knights of Christendom. Good night, everybody.